The self-destruct sequence has been activated. Repeat, the self-destruct sequence has been activated. This sequence may not be aborted.
All employees proceed to the bottom platform. All employees proceed to the bottom platform. All employees proceed to the bottom platform.
Hey, I'm Will.
And I'm Chris.
We're the Rat Boys. Today we'll be reviewing and comparing Resident Evil 3 and its remake.
Once again, this is not a first-time play for either of us.
The general consensus is that the remake is bad and the original is a masterpiece. And before this deep analyzation, we would wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. The question is it that cut and dry? Is the original as good as everyone claims it to be? Is the remake that terrible? That's what we're here to find out.
Before we begin, let's do a quick explanation of the reviewing process.
We take 11 properties that every game should have and grade them individually.
We then average them together to get our personal scores.
And then we average those to get our final verdict.
Now, let's get into it.
Resident Evil 3 was released September 22nd, 1999, and is available on PC, PS1, Dreamcast, and GameCube, which is the version that we played for this review. Similar games include Silent Hill 2, Dino Crisis 2, and Extermination. The casual time to beat is between 5 to 6 hours of gameplay.
The remake was released April 2nd, 2020, and is available for PC, PS4, 5, Xbox One, SX, and Switch. Similar games include Dead Space 2, Uncharted, and Tomb Raider. The casual time to beat is around 4 hours.
The games are officially survival horror, but they're more like action games with horror elements, and this is reinforced in the remake.
Both games are developed and published by Capcom, who also brought us Steel Battalion, Beautiful Joe, and Okami.
Jill Valentine is one of the last remaining people in Raccoon City to witness the atrocities Umbrella performed. To stop her, Umbrella unleashes their ultimate secret weapon, Nemesis.
Thanks, Steam. That really cleared things up. The events of Resident Evil 3 take place on the same time as Resident Evil 2, but follows Jill Valentine, who survived the events of Resident Evil 1, and newcomer Carlos Oliveira, who works as a mercenary for the Umbrella Corporation. Their main objective being to escape the city.
Only one little thing really stands in the way. Nemesis, an experimental biological weapon with one purpose: kill all stars. Unfortunately for Jill, most of the STARS members are either dead or out of town.
Each game has a cast of supporting characters, but are mostly underutilized in the original compared to the remake.
The original has a choose-your-own-adventure aspect that can narratively change the story.
Both games ultimately end with the most important parts in line with each other.
As to be expected, the original has the old tank controls and fixed camera angles, but also brings in ammo crafting, action dodging, and weapon crafting, which is similar to 2's weapon upgrades.
The remake went to a over-the-shoulder, third-person view, modern controls, and refined the dodge mechanic of the original. It also simplified ammo crafting, but also cut aspects of that in the process.
The original had a convoluted ammo crafting system that, if used the right way, would provide you with more powerful versions of the ammo you're crafting. This was cut in the remake, but is ultimately unimportant. More on that later.
The original's choose-your-own-adventure sections would freeze the screen of a cutscene and give you 2 choices on a timer. Once selected, different events would play out. Some of these choices are more important than the others.
The remake's dodge mechanic feels really good to me, and if done right, you can dodge every attack pretty consistently, and in turn, will make you feel pretty badass.
Fights with Nemesis are definitely far more memorable in the remake than they were in the original, but they ended up feeling super samey between the 2 dogfights. The city fights are not nearly as memorable, however. It really only shines when it comes to the arenas fights.
Nemesis is supposed to come off as this imposing and devastating figure that you can't hide from and you can't kill. In my opinion, the mythos and hype of Nemesis is bigger than what he actually is in-game. The only time you're going to feel desperate is if you're taking the time to actually fight him. And for me, even the word desperate is a little too strong at times. On the other hand, running is the much easier option, and you will actually be in a much better position in the end, but that doesn't make him bad. Nemesis is an imposing figure, and he can really mess you up. It is a very cool aspect of the game and is the game's namesake. For the job that he is supposed to be doing, it is still done decently well. He's there to inconvenience and frustrate you, and if you let him, he definitely will do that. He is tough as nails, and his controls are a lot better than your controls. Fighting him is a complete resource sink, but you will be rewarded for doing so. On hard anyways. Now, if those rewards are worth it, that's a different conversation, and we'll talk about that later. But overall, Nemesis is a good aspect of the original.
Boy, the map as always, I don't feel like elaborating too deeply. This goes for both the remake and original. Much like 2, the continuation from one part of the city to the next is well placed and put out, though it is very odd to have another lab not too far down the road from the other one. I assume it's not that far anyways. Like, how many labs could these corporations have in the same city? All hidden underground. This is approaching trillions of dollars spent on these facilities.
The original made the city feel like the outbreak was actually happening. Occasionally you would see civilians or soldiers running away from zombies, and then hearing screams off in the distance. This doesn't happen throughout the entire game, but that makes sense, because as time goes on there would be less and less survivors. And the respawning enemies also solidifies the immersion of a dying city. Ammo crafting in the original can be complicated, especially when you find out about enhanced ammo. But regardless, it's the most extensive ammo crafting system that we have in the entire series. As far as enhanced ammo goes, you'll have to do some research, or maybe we'll edit a thing in here, like a chart. But either way, you don't need it to beat the game or to defeat Nemesis, but it's a really cool feature.
Gunpowder mixtures were very cool in the original, like being able to do all these mixtures and having tons of options of what ammo to create. The downside was that most ammo wasn't extremely useful. Acid worked really well against a one-time fight, and freeze rounds were strong against Nemesis. Flame rounds weren't worth making really, otherwise you just had handgun rounds and shotgun shells, or their enhanced variant, along with magnum ammo if you did triple Cs.
The original's cutscene choices are such a cool idea of a mechanic, and it's used decently well throughout the entire game, but not every choice is worth making. I do wish that it did stick around for the remake, and even in other Resident Evil games, but I guess we'll never see it again after this.
Most options had some kind of impact at a later point in the game, or in the immediate game. Then there were some bad choices that did nothing as far as I could tell.
Most of the weapons in the original are pretty good. The pistols are improved from Resident Evil 2. The grenade launcher with the combination of ammo crafting lets you use rounds that you would actually want to use. Shotguns are decent versus minion monsters. The aforementioned rewards from Nemesis that being a pistol and a shotgun that you get parts for and have to put together after defeating him a certain amount of times, are decent, but not needed at all to finish the game or to enjoy the game. Though the mine thrower is pretty mid in my opinion, unless you give it infinite ammo and then there's a bunch of shenanigans that you can do with that. But I liked that the remake made the mines into a grenade round instead. RIP freeze rounds. The action in the remake is very exciting and very cinematic. The whole game feels like an action movie from start to finish. Now, does that hold true to the original's form? Well, sort of. Resident Evil 3 was already going in an action-y route in the original, so it's not so far-fetched that this is the style that they would want back then. There are negative aspects to it, and we will get into those, but for the action itself, I would consider that to be a very good thing. With how short the remake game is, it actually conveys the story quite well. The changes to side characters, making a lot of them more important than what they were in the original. The expressions and body languages in the cutscenes really selling the story and how they're feeling in the moment. This is another thing that we'll get more into as the video continues, but the story itself in the remake is done surprisingly well for the time that you spend inside the game.
Dodging. It was just awful ultimately. It wasn't set in a good way. It should have given you iframes. I know they probably didn't think of that back then, but making the dodges random made them just about useless. Especially since sometimes you dodge right into a hit. It did save me a couple of times, but I just avoided dodging almost altogether, and just used movement as the dodge instead.
The dodge in the original is pretty trash. There's no iframes, so most dodges made whenever they really needed to count ended with you getting punched in the face. Also, the trigger for a dodge was by pushing the aim button at the right time or by trying to shoot at the right time, which can actually lead to involuntary dodges. And this was a big issue whenever it came to fighting bugs and hunters, because you would constantly dodge around the attacks whenever you were just trying to shoot them, but whenever you were dodging, you would get hit anyways. The biggest glaring issue with the remake is how they decided to handle Nemesis. I personally can kind of see what they were trying to go for with the whole action movie style of game, but they did not convey it well whenever it came to the imposing nature of what Nemesis should have been. You can see how good it could have been. It's in there, somewhere. To be honest, there's aspects of the original Nemesis that was underwhelming as well, but they had an opportunity to improve Nemesis, and they did not. Now, there's entire videos about this specific subject, but we don't have time to go through all of it in this video, but it is a bad aspect about the game.
The lack of reward that you gain from taking down Nemesis, and how easy he is to take down, feels awful. Outside of his arena fights, that is. Then there's the point of taking him down for him to just get right back up. Also, I don't like the cinematic plays they put on of forcing you to run from him.
I've got no proof of this, but it really does seem like the two Cerberus fights have the potential to cheat you out of damage and ammo. I say this because certain events seem to need to play out during the fights. But yeah, I might be wrong, but my 70 hours and multiple times playing this game, I've always felt like the dogfights have some really shady mechanics behind, and I can't find any proof about these feelings. It's not that big of a deal, the fights are still very doable, but there's definitely something going on in the background. There's games with good fixed camera angles, and then there's games with bad fixed camera angles. And I did not like the majority of the camera angles in this game, especially in an area that you fight Nemesis in. There's so many awkward angles and cuts compared to other games that use fixed camera angles. Pretty easy to get knocked around into 2 or 3 areas just based off of one Nemesis throw.
Standard difficulty is back to being far too easy. They sacrifice in specific areas to fix others in these games, and then those sacrifices make the game too easy. I think they made zombies' health pools very low in this game versus what they did in RE2 Remake.
The dogs in the original are bullet sponges. It takes almost a full mag dump of pistol with no criticals to take down a single dog. Admittedly, they have long stun animations, so shooting them and running away from them is valid, but then you have to deal with them again whenever you come back through the area. So you either mag dump the dogs, or you risk getting hit every time you walk into that hallway or parking garage. And there's a lot of dogs in the original. Otherwise, this wouldn't be as much of an annoying aspect to me. So yeah, dogs. The second biggest issue with the remake is that it's simply too short. And this is pretty noticeable with how much they shove at you at once. And it's to be expected as soon as you realize you're playing in a movie and not a game. Resident Evil 3 Remake is a firework. It's fast, loud, flashy, and before you know it, it's over. If there was just 2 to 3 more hours of content here, this game wouldn't have received as much hate as it did. They had the content available, but they just decided not to use it.
Gunpowder situation feels worse, but I understand why they did it. It's to lessen the amount of gunpowder needed in the game in general, and to make more use out of different gunpowders as well. It is unfortunate they took away the enhanced ammo though, seeing as they make you keep the beginning weapon in the remake. It would have been nice to have more powerful ammo at endgame if you mixed properly.
Games hide stuff, but this game hides quite a bit, like the whole enhanced ammo thing, how to unlock the epilogues, how to unlock Jill's diary. There's a lot of stuff to find out, but unless you look it up, you might have a very confusing time and not even know that some of these things exist at all. Doesn't make it bad or good, but it's an old game with old game shenanigans. As I say every time whenever it comes to these games, tank controls are flawed, obviously. However, with just a little time and practice, things will smooth out for you. Tank controls should not keep you from playing a game, and does not dictate whether a game is good or bad. It's just something you need to learn how to use. The original Resident Evil 3 is unquestionably the most challenging out of the original trilogy. There's tons of enemies, Nemesis is always on your ass, though not fighting Nemesis makes the game a lot easier. But either way, it's not bad, but it should be noted. An easy mode exists, but I feel like you would be cheating yourself out of an experience. The original is chock full of puzzles, and the remake has a few, and most of them are all pretty decent across the board. But there are a couple of trash puzzles too. Just keep that in mind if you're considering playing the entire series in general. You're always going to have some kind of puzzle, and not all of them are going to be great, but none of them are too hard to deal with. Hate it, like it, or don't care, this game does the yellow paint trope, because gamers are too dumb to find a ladder or box unless it's covered in yellow paint. I personally do not think that yellow tape on everything all over the place is necessary. It bothers me a little bit, but the mass majority of people probably don't even notice or just don't care. Either way, it's definitely not a deal breaker of any sort, but expect to see a lot of yellow paint everywhere.
The randomized loot in-game. Like, it's a neat concept, it's cool, but it's super annoying not getting hills where you previously found hills, or enemies just changing altogether to something less desirable for that area. Also, it's seemingly without pattern, like it's based on footsteps or time in-game. I guess it keeps the runs kinda different since you won't have exactly what you had last time, but it wasn't something I enjoyed way too much. For its time, it wasn't ahead on graphics versus too many other games, but it wasn't behind other games either, really. It was a solid game visually. I'll give it a 6 for being slightly above the average game back then. As for the remake, visually, the game is absolutely stunning. It is the Arby's of games. It's got the graphics. We had some hiccups, but it still was great, mostly because the game focused much more on cinematics than it did enemies and the general gameplay. For all of that, I'll give the visuals a 10.
The original's graphics are pretty rough, unsurprisingly. Nemesis is cool, but the age of everything just really doesn't hold up for me, so that's a 4. The remake is a full 10. Everything looks great. The cutscenes are even in-game rendered, so there's no difference in quality throughout. The motion of character eyes are amazing. Hunters have an armored shell that explode off of them to expose their weak flesh. And even Nemesis looks great throughout his forms. I find it hard to think of a game that looks better than this game. You could argue that the yellow tape and the head hugger enemy things aren't aesthetically pleasing, but find me a game with better facial and eye expressions.
Both games had solid audio. They delivered on what they were supposed to deliver on for the most part. The original could have had better musical pieces, and the general sound of the environments could have been better as well. As for the remake, there were cuts in audio I noticed from Nemesis streams. Maybe it was an audio glitch, but there were times where he would scream, obviously, and nothing came out. This happened in the RE2 remake as well, with Birkin and X. Solid either way. It's a 7 for both.
Nothing too special for either one of these for me. The original has Nemesis saying stars, and that's iconic. And some of the music is cool, but nothing really stands out too much for me. But nothing bothered me either, so that's a 5. The remake has good sound effects, and the voice acting is phenomenal. The sounds of enemies and environments were more noticeable than the actual music, but I say the general listening experience equates to a 7.
The story was well put together. They didn't veer off center, and most options that changed the story changed it in interesting ways from what I've seen. It's a good story, but it definitely needed to be worked on, so I'll give the original a 6 for the creative process back then, but not doing it as well as they definitely could have. For the remake, just like the graphics, they were focusing on story as well. They gave Carlos more time in this game, and they even fleshed out more ideas with Nemesis and his transformations. They even get you to the end-game area in a better fashion, really. Like outside of getting to the underground area because every other area was blocked off, in the remake, you have a good reason to be in the final area, whereas it feels like you stumble upon the ending area in the original. The story was a 9.
The story in the original plays out decently enough to get the job done, but kinda opens plot holes in the overarching Resident Evil story. The choose your own adventure thing doesn't help in that aspect either, especially towards the end of the game. Jill's and Carlos's relationship is displayed nicely, but it's touch and go based on the choices that you make. 5 rats for the original. And I might catch some flack for this, but the remake has a better representation of the story. It simply just does. With the short amount of time that you have in this game, a lot of information is pushed out, whether through notes or through words. The remake makes way better use of the side characters, specifically Nikolai, and shows how much of a pure douchebag he really is. And Carlos is a much more developed and believable character. 7 rat boys.
The pacing overall was an 8 in the original. They didn't shit the bed with the pacing. Generally goes forward without feeling offbeat. You mostly go through areas that make sense. Except for one. For me, it's getting the fuel additive, which is in a pharmaceutical-esque place. Placement just didn't add up. There's no reason for it to be there. The pacing in the remake feels so sporadic for me. It's just so weird how everything is set, whereas the original felt much more natural. It mostly has to do with not following Jill throughout most of the game, and there's gaps where you don't actually see how the characters got to where they are, like being put in the hospital after what happened. Then there's doing the fight on the burning building. How'd Nemesis know you were there? How do you know you were anywhere for that matter? Breaking through walls and grabbing you. It's good on pacing, don't get me wrong, but it just didn't feel right. Pacing is a 6 for me.
Pacing is decent in both games. The original is faster paced than the Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 1 original, but it still has that solid map layout that those games had, and the resource distribution is also equatable to those games. Though because of the ammo crafting mechanic, you won't really be worrying about ammo very often. The changes of location and environment is nice. The only thing that slows this game down is fighting Nemesis, but again, you don't have to fight him. That's an 8. The remake runs fast, and is designed to run fast. Too fast, though. Even though the direction they decided to go with the game may be controversial, it's still well designed to go in that direction smoothly. 7 rats.
It was rough around the edges because of the mechanics with dodging. However, the gameplay as it stands was fine. The beginning was rough for sure, but that was probably because I wanted to get all Nemesis drops, and ran my head into the brick wall that was Nemesis. It's a 7 for sure. The gameplay in the remake felt a lot better this time around for me. You don't have issues with dodging like previously. However, getting the hang of dodging was much worse for me. But overall, most of the scripted fights felt good, and killing zombies didn't feel like a slog as they had in the Resident Evil 2 remake. I'm giving gameplay an 8.
For the most part, the gameplay of the original holds up. The typical run, stop, aim, shoot is decent. The rough patches here is fighting Nemesis. He is generally able to control himself a lot better than you can, and he's not afraid to show you that. But it's Nemesis. The dodge is the other issue. It can really get in the way of what you're actually trying to do. But overall, it's a 7 rats. The remake's core gameplay feels really good. Aiming feels nice, dodge is fun to be utilized. The only really lame thing that there is for the remake is there's too many chase sequences that are used as vehicles to get you to a location than actual gameplay to be had. I also found the last couple of bosses to be pretty lackluster, but I'm still giving this game an 8 because the core gameplay is so good outside of those aspects.
Dodging kinda ruined the gameplay for me. Dodging not having iframes screws you over in quite a few scenarios, mostly in tight spaces, and most of the places you fight in are tight spaces. Mechanics were very low for dodging alone, but gunpowder and other minor things brought it back up. It's a 5 for me, Chief. For the remake, when it works for you, it works for you. The dodging is actually good because they actually give iframes, and the box has the sorting function brought back from Resident Evil 2 Remake. Gunpowder doesn't carry like it did in the past though, and taking away enhanced ammo kinda sucks to be honest. But I guess I get it, they wanted to make the game more challenging. I'll put this score at a 7.
So, the original has weapon crafting, ammo crafting, dodge, and that choose your own adventure thing. Weapon crafting only comes from defeating Nemesis, and the weapons themselves made from this are inconsequential. Ammo crafting is deep, but not very well explained outside of the basic manual, and the dodge is bad. Kinda just wish you could turn it off, to be honest. The choices are cool, but some are just pointless. Like the one where these boxes are falling towards you, and you either pick to get out of the hole or fall into the hole. But then you just get out of the hole whenever you go into the hole, and you don't get anything from it. The remake does weapon upgrades, ammo crafting, dodge, and completely cut the choice mechanic altogether. The weapon upgrades are got from defeating Nemesis in his first form, similar to the original, but it's just upgrades for your base pistol instead of new weapons. But defeating him unfortunately consists of one grenade. He is, even on the hardest difficulty, Nemesis is a complete joke to actually take down. But the upgrades are good. Ammo crafting is a solid and simple mechanic, but it's nothing special. But the dodge makes this game for me personally. I really like it. The choice thing being cut sucks, but again, a lot of those choices were pointless, and they were trying to push the main story, the canon story. So for me personally, it evens out, and it's a 6 rats for both games.
I mean, they weren't breaking grounds here with the characters or anything, but they weren't horrible. Carlos helps Jill pretty much each time they meet, and he does have a moment of depression, but it doesn't get brought up later. Jill mostly stays the same throughout, but she does show fear and apprehension of Nemesis, and then goes from that to more wanting him to die. I'll give this a 6. For the remake, there's much better character development. Maybe it's because they didn't have that many cutscenes to work with in the original, but they definitely fleshed out characters in this game. They gave Mikkel more screen time, along with Nikolai, for that matter. I almost forgot about Tyrell as well, because he's almost unknown, considering the most dialogue you get from him is hidden by going the incorrect way first while in the hospital in the original. For character development, I'll give remakes an 8.
Again, the original does enough to get by, and that's about it. Jill gets a little bit of growth, Carlo adds to the plot, Nikolai and Mikhail are just kind of there. Though Nikolai does do some things depending on your choices, but he may or may not be relevant altogether depending on what you decide to do. In the end, I consider this to be the overall norm, so 5 Rat Boys. The remake does a decent improvement on the previously mentioned aspects, really explaining Jill's lore between games, and Nikolai really shows his true colors. And again, Carlos is just a more down-to-earth character. The thing between Jill and Carlos is also a bit more believable and expressed better throughout the cutscenes. And I can't remember his name, but Carlos has a partner that is definitely more utilized in the remake than he was in the original. It's moderate improvements, but the cutscenes really sell things. So 6 rats.
The world development in this game is actually quite groundbreaking in my opinion. At least for Resident Evil franchise. Your choices can even give access to otherwise inaccessible areas, one of those two being completely unnecessary. Then there's backtracking to open up previously unreachable locations, like in the case of getting the second crank, or going all the way back to the warehouse for some extra gunpowder, giving the world building a 9. I think it's excellent. The original had much better world development than the remake. It just doesn't feel lived in like the original did. You had people dying in the streets just out of camera view during the first 2 hours of the original. Then there's stuff like the yellow tape to point you in the right direction. The world is, awful, mostly. I guess I get it for people that are colorblind, but it just seemed bad, really. There's ways to show, not tell, and this game did a whole lot of telling you where to go. This gets a 4 rats.
You go all over town in these games. From Jill's apartment to the police department from RE2, from using the transit system, a hospital, shady labs. The lore about what's happening to people in town, from civilians to mercenaries, are all throughout town, which helps with the world building aspect in both games. There's not much in the way of shortcuts like in the previous games, and the remake ends up cutting more than it ends up reimagining things, specifically the park and the clock tower. There was really no reason to have less content than the original, but if you didn't know they cut stuff, then you wouldn't care as much, right? Either way, 6 rats for the original and 5 rats for the remake.
Both games were a 6 for me. They were fun, but they both lack something that I can't put my finger on completely. For the original, it feels like most of this issue comes from dodging not working by giving iframes. For the remake, I feel most of the issue comes from mostly everything being cinematic, like being forced to run from Nemesis, or lack of rewards from beating Nemesis, and how a single grenade during his chasing you through the city takes him out, but not for long, because he gets right back up after roughly 20 seconds. Why take away the permanent down they gave you in the original?
Both games are fun. They just are. It's a fun time. If you like challenging yourself anyways. I don't touch easy or standard modes usually, and this was no exception. The original Nemesis fights can be very challenging and frustrating if you're not used to it. But again, it's completely optional for you to fight Nemesis. It's only necessary for you to fight Nemesis about 3 times throughout the entire game. I really like the gameplay and challenge of the higher difficulties for the remake, minus the last fight in Inferno. The early stages of the game, along with the lab and hospital, are actually really good areas. But again, it ends so fast that you're not really able to truly appreciate what you're going through. Regardless, fun is fun. 7 for the original and 8 for the remake.
The original has a lot of replayability. You've got several choices you can make in the game. There's a few that are quite pointless, however most are solid because they change later gameplay or cutscenes. Then there's the Mercenaries mode. It's not bad. Run from the train car to the warehouse, kill zombies along the way, and gain more time for kills. Simple and kind of enjoyable. I'll give the replayability a 7 rats. In the remake, it's the same game over and over again. You get the same cinematic events, outside of one choice at the end based on how well you aim. And even then, you can't replay for that unless you missed it the first time. The aftergame stuff is multiplayer from my understanding, and I can't recommend multiplayer if you're coming to a game to play the story. Otherwise, I guess the infinite weapon unlocks and other items to make the regular game easier is something to replay for. For this, I give replayability a 4.
Both games get an 8 for replayability, but for different reasons. The original has its unlockables, the epilogues, the mercenary mode, which I don't really care about, but it's there. The choice differences to experience the story, trying to get your score grade up at the end of the game, and it's short enough to do in a day. On top of that, the item and enemies in some areas are random, so that can help keep things interesting. The remake also has its grades, viable equipment for future playthroughs, which again I don't really care about because why do I want a game to be easier that I can already beat? But it's there. And there's 2 hidden difficulties, which is where the real challenge of the game really comes in, if you opt out of the cheaty equipment, that is. But alas, it's a fun game to blow through again and again, and it's short enough that you could play through it a few times in a day if you wanted to. So yes, they're both quite replayable.
I felt pretty good at the end of the game. Final fight was lackluster, but overall, it was a struggle to get through the game beating Nemesis every time, but a mostly fair struggle when you learn patterns for Nemesis and how to combat him. For this, I give the original's final feelings an 8. It was a good game, but it just didn't feel amazing or exceptional to me. I wanted something from it, but it didn't deliver that something. From the lack of rewards from Nemesis, to the running away sections, it was more cinematic narratively and gameplay-wise. Because of these things, I feel that it suffered, so it's a 6 rats.
After finishing the original, I felt pretty good. The baseline challenge, the story, the final fight was meh, but overall it was a really good experience. 7 rats. Now, I've been singing the praises of the remake for the most part up until this point, but I see what this game could have been to what it is. This game could have been the best Resident Evil of all time. It's in there. You can see glimmers of it. But they chose not to put in the effort to get it there. They cut content, They made Nemesis a pushover. They didn't expand on any of the levels. This game should have gotten the love that the Resident Evil 2 remake got, but we won't be getting another Resident Evil 3 remake, possibly ever. This is it, and that aspect really bothers me. Maybe if they didn't make that trash online game that you get with purchasing this game, we would have seen a better experience here with all the content that it deserved to have. But for what it is, it's just completely inexcusable. 4 rats for my final feels whenever it comes to the remake.
The average I got for the original and the remake were both 6.8s, for different reasons. I like the rewards from Nemesis for fighting him in the original, and the mechanics of the gunpowder. The little things really added up in the old game. As for the remake, it was visually appealing, the story was well written, but it just lacked pretty hard as well in the other aspects, like the yellow tape or the pacing.
My personal score for the original Resident Evil 3 is a 6.2. Honestly, I wanted this to be higher, because before the review, I considered it to be the best Resident Evil in the series. I even played through it 3 times for this review, just to be sure. And conceptually, it's still my favorite. But as a game, there's better Resident Evils. But a 6.2 is still a solid score, given how hard it is to score high within our scoring system. It's still a good game. The remake is a 6.9 for me. I can hear the hate now, but if you've watched up until this point, you know my reasonings. There's a lot of things that did better than the original. It just didn't live up to its potential. As a game, it's good, and as a remake to Nemesis himself, it's a damn shame. That being said, it's a 6.9, not a 7. And there's a big difference between those two numbers. It's good, but it's not an amazing game. It had a lot more potential for what it actually put out.
It's a 6.5 for the averages combined. It all falls back on things that have been talked about to death at this point. It sucks to give the game a lower score than something like a solid 7 or an 8, especially because of the nostalgia from playing the game as a child. But the game just wasn't outright amazing, or a 10 out of 10. It has its issues. I wish that it was better, and that it did live up to the hype of what everyone says about it. But it's still a good game ultimately, and our rating of 6 and above is rated as good ultimately. Just not amazing.
The final verdict for Resident Evil 3 Remake is a 6.85. For a remake to score so closely to the original game should say a lot. The game is improved from its predecessor, but not by much. Regardless, it's still a good game. If they focused solely on this game instead of the trash multiplayer game, we might have had a legendary game right now. But we have what we have, and that's what we have. But even though it's a good game, I cannot recommend buying this game at its full price of $40, and that's on Steam. On the console, if they're still charging $60, that's crazy. Now, buying it also gives you Resident Evil Resistance, which is that dead multiplayer game that they don't even care about at this point. But this remake should have been a $20 DLC for the Resident Evil 2 remake in its current state. It's a very strange spot to be in, having all that potential and a good score, but just too short to actually recommend buying. But out of the 2 games, which one should a newcomer to the series play? Well, it really depends on what you're trying to get out of the series itself. If you're playing for the story and you have the money, the remake is going to be a better experience. But if you want to see Nemesis in his fittest form and you have the resources and know-how, the original is your best bet. Both games can be challenging, and both games have their shortcomings. They're very blatant shortcomings. Either way you go, it's going to be solid though. That may be a controversial take, but some of you are so blinded by nostalgia that you need to take those glasses off. Some of the content cut from the original wasn't that great to begin with. But yes, the remake could have done way more, but this is reality, and we have to deal with it. Go look at some mods. Alright, we got BioRand for the original. This is a randomizer for the PC version of the Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, and it's been around for a really long time, and it's used a lot. Next is the Resident Evil 3 Remake Randomizer by Nate Cirque NH. I don't know, whatever. I've used this mod before all the updates. I assume it still works, but due to how the game is made, it's not going to be as good as the randomizers for 1 and 2. Next, we have the Triple Threat 1999 Inventory Sounds, Title Voice, and Music by Rika's 316. This just brings all of those classic sounds to the remake. Honestly, the mods for this game are lacking. There's a bunch of costumes and guns, but nothing that really stands out to me. I would suggest checking out ResidentEvilModding.boards.net. They have some really cool mods for all of these games, but I hate navigating their site to try and find them. But you should definitely check out some of the stuff they have and follow the rules and whatnot of their forum. But they have some really good mods over there for a lot of these games.
So that's it. That's how we feel about these games. And if you liked our video, give us a like. What did you think about the review? Tell us down below so we can continue to evolve and create better content. Until next time, Rat Boys out.
Round 3. Fight! Fatality.